Episode 270, The Secret Tender Club. It was the end of another busy day on the island of Sodor. Percy had just finished doing a coal run with Hector to Navert Station and was looking forward to having a rest in the shed. However, he was surprised to see James, Henry, and Gordon were already there. James was on the turntable blocking Percy out. "And just what do you think you're doing, Percy?" asked James. "Stop fooling, James. I've had a busy day and I want to rest. Now let me in. These sheds are reserved for members of the Secret Tender Club." "What's that?" asked Percy. "That's no concern to you, Percy. And besides, this club is for tender engines only." "That's right," said James. "No tank engines allowed." Percy was cross and left in a huff. Percy soon found Nia and Thomas and told them everything. "Those big engines said the same thing to me." "And me," said Nia. "Too puffed up in the smoke box, I say," Thomas. "Well, what are we going to do?" said Percy. Just then, Edward pulled up. "You three look glum." "We are, Edward," said Percy, and Thomas, Nia, and Percy told Edward all about the Secret Tender Club. Edward frowned. "I'll investigate for you. I assume they'll talk to me, considering I have a tender." "Thank you, Edward," said Thomas, Percy, and Nia. "And good luck," said Thomas. "I'll need it," said Edward. Edward soon arrived at Tinmouth Sheds, where he saw the big engines laughing and joking. "What's all this here?" asked Edward. "Ah, Edward," said James. "Just the engine I wanted to see. I would like to invite you into our club." "What club?" asked Edward. "The Secret Tender Club," said James. "We're always on the lookout for new members," said Gordon. We just invited Emily here to join." Edward looked unimpressed. "And members get to have special benefits," said Henry. "Indeed," said James. "Our drivers will let us taste human food." "Well, I think that's silly. Engines can't eat food." "Well, I guess you're gonna miss out all the fun," said James. Edward then puffed away. "Well, I tried," said Edward. The next day, all the drivers and firemen arrived with eggs, sausage, beans, and bacon. They lit their engines' fires and cooked them on the shovels and settled down for a fireman's breakfast. Then they whipped up another batch for the engines to try. "Are you ready?" said one of the drivers. "Yes," said the 4 engines. So the firemen of each engine dumped the food into their firebox. Doesn't taste different. It's no different than the fires we're used to," said Emily. "Though my firebox does smell a bit different." "Indeed," said Gordon. "Much better than the coal-burning smell we're used to." "Indeed," said James. "I guess you're all fond of a fireman's breakfast," said one of the drivers. "We'll have to do this again tomorrow." "Hooray!" said the 4 engines. Later that day, Gordon, James, Emily, and Henry told the other tender engines about the breakfast meal they had had. Thomas, Percy, and Nia were still cross at being removed from the shed. Toby tried to cheer them up. I remember back on my old line, said Toby. My driver and fireman used to cook food in my firebox from time to time. But I bet they didn't make a silly club out of it, said Nia. Indeed, said Percy. What if we made our own club, said Thomas, and we won't let them in? No, Thomas, said Toby. If you did that, you'd be no better than they are. I suppose you're right, said Thomas. I'm sure they'll get bored of it eventually. The next morning, the Secret Tender Club had their early breakfast meeting again, and they were enjoying themselves immensely. I gotta say, said Henry, I keep liking these bacon they make. Same with the sausages, said James. And indeed, said Emily. I kinda like it, said Gordon. Better than the coal-burning smell. You said that yesterday, Gordon, said James. Well, I wanted to say it again today, said Gordon. Later that day, Percy was pulling the mail. He arrived at Navard Station, where the fat controller saw him. You do look glum, Percy, said Sir Topham Hatt. Yes, sir, I am, sir. Why? It's the big engines, sir. They made their own secret club and have breakfast every morning, and they won't let me or Thomas or Nia in the sheds. Yes, Percy, said Sir Topham Hatt. Edward told me all about the Secret Tender Club. And me too, said Winston, since I was with Sir Topham Hatt. And while it has not caused confusion or delay, it is unfair to you, Thomas, and Nia. But what shall we do, sir? Don't worry, said Sir Topham Hatt. I know what to do. Sir Topham Hatt had a plan. That evening, the big engines were ready for a good night's rest when Thomas, Percy, and Nia pulled up to the turntable. Excuse me, said James, but you tankies are trespassing on Secret Tender Club property. I think you'll find, said a familiar voice, that these sheds are part of my railway, and thus belong to me. Gordon, Henry, Emily, and James gasped. And plus, since these sheds are part of my railway, I can decide who and who doesn't get to sleep here. But, sir, stammered James. Therefore, Sir Topham Hatt concluded, I declare that any of my engines are allowed to stay here, regardless if they have a tender or not. Yes, sir, said James, feeling defeated. Sorry, sir. Thomas, Percy, and Nia were very happy to have their sheds back. One more thing, James, said Sir Topham Hatt. Your breakfast scheme has given me a very good idea. And what an idea it was. The next day, Sir Topham Hatt had asked the engines of the steam team to help cook firemen's breakfast for their crews, workers, and families. Even Sir Topham Hatt was enjoying himself, as well as his family, who was at Knapford Station. Sir Topham Hatt had parked Winston in a siding at Tidmouth's sheds out of the way. Everyone was enjoying themselves, including James. Well, James, said Edward, I suppose you now know that it's best to share the fun with others, rather than keeping it to yourself. I suppose you're right, said James, even if you don't have a tender. And Edward wholeheartedly agreed.